Welcome back to another episode of Prep Talk. We missed last week. Both Mark and I were busy, and Mark did put up a nice Prep Talk thought. But anyways, we thought we'd do another episode this week. And this week's title is, What is the True Sabbath? What do you have to say about that, Mark?
Yeah, so this is an interesting subject that, I put up a post about the Sabbath last Friday as well. But more and more as time goes on, we're starting to see more of these kind of attacks against Sabbath keeping. It's always been a point of contention. The Protestant world and the Catholic Church for centuries sanctified and kept the first day of the week holy, and then a lot of the Protestants just carried on with that. But then this biblical Sabbath started coming out again. And ever since then, it's been a point of contention. Mm-hmm. And so more and more as we get towards the fulfillment of God's prophecies in the end times, we're starting to see more of these kind of attacks on the Sabbath. And so this one actually came up this week, and it was really enlightening discussion with this one fellow who was making the claim that we just can't possibly know what day is actually the God-ordained at creation Sabbath, because there's been calendar changes and different things, and so there's a bunch of claims involved with that, and it's a very subversive type of argument too. It was not an argument based on intellectual discourse between two people. Mm-hmm. The Bible says, let us reason together. Mm-hmm. So we should be able to come and reason and discuss complicated subjects that we maybe don't understand. And so, of course, that's what we try to do here. But when you have these attacks come in, it's nothing like that. It's very much so not based in intelligent discourse. But it is interesting to hear these arguments and where they're coming from. And so it allows us to educate ourselves so that we can have a good defense for them. Right. And of course have the confidence that, yes, we are in fact keeping the true biblical Sabbath that God had ordained at creation. So.
Well, with that, why don't we have some prayer and then get started?
Absolutely. Sure.
Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for this day. I want to thank you for the blessings that you have given us. I ask that your Spirit be upon us, that when we speak, that it would be your truth. Mm. Thank you for being with us today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, this show is called Prep Talk, and we started it because, we have this understanding that Friday is the preparation day, and we're preparing for the Sabbath, which would be the next day. And and so we've had this, we've been confident of this for a long time. So then you get these people that come in and try to rattle that confidence, try to create doubt and sow confusion, of course, and that's really what the devil tries to do, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So the argument is, of course, people like to have proof from God's Word. We want to prove everything from God's Word. And so it gets a little bit tricky because, they make claims like this where they say, well, the Word, nowhere in the Bible does it say that Saturday is God's Sabbath.
Well, that's true. It does not say the title Saturday. That's true.
Mm-hmm. And it makes lots of reference to the first day of the week. But again, it also doesn't say that the first day of the week is Sunday.
No, it just says first day of the week. Yeah.
So what's really interesting is a lot of these people don't have a problem referring to Sunday as the first day of the week.
Yeah.
So this is where their logic starts to break down because they won't argue that the Christians who are worshiping on Sunday are not keeping the true Sunday. Mm-hmm. I'm not aware that that's even a thing. So for some reason, they're picking on the Sabbath only, fully accepting that Sunday is the first day of the week, but that the Sabbath may not fall on Saturday. Mm-hmm. So right there already we have a biblical point of contention because like this story here in Luke. Now, all the Gospels record the story of Jesus in the tomb and the cross. But I like Luke for this argument because Luke actually wasn't a Jew, and I'll get into why that matters in a bit. But we can look here in Luke chapter 23, right at the end of 23 here, verse 54, and it says, the day was the preparation day and the Sabbath drew near. Mm-hmm. So here he's laying out the timeline. Mm-hmm. We got the preparation day was the day before the Sabbath. And then the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after, and they observed the tomb and his body, where his body was laid. They returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment.
Mm-hmm.
So now, in case anybody tries to argue that this was not the seventh-day Sabbath, but it was one of the other many Sabbaths that the Jews kept, like a lot of the festival feasts. This one here says the Sabbath according to the commandment. So this implies he was talking about the fourth commandment.
Well, yeah, it's the commandment too. It wasn't a commandment, so it was very specific, right?
Yeah, this is the commandment, the Sabbath commandment, and so this would have been the tables of stone Sabbath commandment.
Yeah.
So we know from this already that Luke is saying that we're talking about God's holy Sabbath happened after the preparation day. So it goes on to say, starting verse 24 now, it says, now on the first day of the week, so they rested on the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. So now on the first day of the week, so this is the next day after the Sabbath. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they went with certain other women with them and came to the tomb bringing the spices which they prepared. But that's when, of course, they found the stone rolled away and the tomb was empty. So we have this layout here, the preparation day. Now, the Gospels tell us that Jesus' death on the cross, he died on the preparation day, but they needed to get him down and prepare him for the burial. Well, they didn't have time to finish it before the Sabbath. And of course, according to the commandment, they were to do no work and any of that stuff on the Sabbath. So here we go. Now the Bible says they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. So they come back now Sunday morning. The Sabbath hours are over very early in the morning, and they want to finish the job. Mm-hmm. They got to continue the day. And of course, now Christ has been risen. So again, we have some issues because most denominations of Christianity all agree that Christ rose on Sunday.
Easter Sunday.
So this is what Easter Sunday is.
Yeah.
So again, these same people who have a point of contention about whether or not the Sabbath was on Saturday should also be arguing that Easter Sunday is not valid because we don't know that it was actually Sunday. But yet I'm not aware that that argument has ever been even attempted to be made.
I have never heard that argument brought up, and that's a really valid point. I would suggest that people like to argue things that go against their routine. Mm-hmm. You know, it's easier for them to, like, the whole world is doing a certain way. Most of the world is worshiping on Sunday. Most of the world, has their routine. Mm-hmm. And so to be a Sabbath keeper is actually challenging. It's not easy. Mm-hmm. You're going against the grain to do it. Yeah. So I find that people, so that makes life challenging for people. Mm-hmm. So in order to combat that challenge, they will find any excuse that they can come up with to keep their Sunday. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they come up with all these kind of interesting arguments. One argument was made that Luke didn't say it was Sunday. He just said first day of the week. He didn't say it was Sunday because maybe he didn't know because of this calendar confusion. Mm. And maybe he didn't know that it was actually Sunday, so he just said it was first day of the week. Mm-hmm. And, it's a little bit... my issue that I would have with that is that Julius Caesar created that calendar in 45 BC. And now we're talking somewhere in the time of Christ, but it was 34, 31 AD when he was crucified. Right. So we're talking 70 some years later that this calendar has been in use in the Roman Empire and basically the known Roman world. It'd be a little silly to think that Luke wasn't up to speed with the fact that they were calling Sunday the first day of the week.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he was obviously literate. He could write.
Yes. So that's the point I have about Luke. Luke was not a Jew.
Yeah.
Luke was a Greek physician and a historian.
That's right.
And so this is a fairly well reputable person, an educated man. And so to argue that maybe he was confused and didn't know what day it was, it's just... that just doesn't fly, right? Mm-hmm. So the other reason why it's important, why I like Luke's gospel and to argue for Luke is, again, because he was Greek. So the people that are mostly making this argument about the calendar confusion, what I found they're trying to do is they're saying that because Moses and the Israelites operated in the Old Testament on the lunar calendar for, 1,400 years, before the Roman calendar was even created. Mm-hmm. And the Roman calendar is a solar calendar. And so the difference is, if you look in the Old Testament, read the Old Testament, you'll see that what God had instructed in their cycles of their harvests and their celebrations and the feast days and all these things are all based on new moons and all this kind of thing. And the different months that God gave to the Israelites were based on the cycles of the moon. Mm-hmm. And so this is a lunar calendar, whereas the solar calendar doesn't go with the phases of the moon. It goes actually with the movement of the earth around the sun. Mm-hmm. And so then that's where we get the 365 days. And, plus or minus a half a day, about 60, I can't remember, 364 point something, but...
Well, that's why we have the 28 days in every 4 years or whatever.
Every 4 years we have to have a leap year to catch up for that slight discrepancy. It goes to 29 days in February every 4 years.
Yeah.
I actually have a friend who was born on February 29th, so he only has a birthday every 4 years. So, so they make course corrections like that. But that has to do with the movement of the sun. So what does any of this have to do with the Sabbath, though? Because their whole argument is based that Moses used the solar calendar, switched to the lunar calendar, switched to the solar calendar. The days got all shuffled around. And so there's just no way that we know what the true biblical Sabbath is anymore.
So what you're saying is that because Moses used the lunar calendar and then we switched over to a solar calendar, that somehow affects the 7-day week cycle?
Well, that would be their claim, but
that's what I'm wondering. Like, that doesn't logically make sense that it would actually mess with the actual week cycle.
Right. So if we just do a little bit of math too, so the lunar cycle, the lunar calendar has 354 days in the year, and if you divide that by 7 days of the weekly cycle, it doesn't divide evenly. It's not an even number. And even with the solar calendar at 365 days, we say it's 52 weeks in a year. But it's not. It's not even. There's a decimal. So it's not perfect, right? So they don't divide divisibly. Neither of them do. And so, I mean, that's already evidence right there that the year, the annual, has absolutely nothing to do with the weekly cycle. They're just two disconnected things. And so the idea that you can alter the amount of days in the entire year somehow messes up the weekly cycle. It's just not logical. And so part of the confusion comes with when they did make some changes, because they did realize at one point, after they had this calendar in force for a while, they started to realize they were getting behind with where the earth was actually in position with the sun. And so they had to make some minor corrections. And so they made a few corrections throughout time where they had to eliminate days out of the calendar to get caught up. So they kind of had to jump ahead, right? And so one of those ones was in 1752. And they went September 2nd, whatever day that was, September 2nd. The next day became September 15. So they kind of leapfrogged a couple weeks there just to advance the calendar so that the end of the year would just come that 2 weeks sooner to speed up the process.
It was exactly 2, it was like 14 days?
September 2, it was September 2 to September 14.
Okay.
So it was 11 days technically.
Okay.
Yeah. So they just did that to skip ahead to bring the end of the year and the solstices. Because the solstices are real things that you can track and measure and see, because it has to do with the distance that the earth is away from the sun as well as the angle of the sun. So these are very real scientific measurements that you can measure. So that's how they noticed they were off. Because they were like, they were saying, well, the solstice shouldn't be happening for another 2 weeks yet. And it's happening now.
Right.
And then they go, oh, well, shoot, I see what's happening. We're a little bit off with our time that it takes the earth to go around the sun, and we've gotten behind, and so we got to skip ahead. So let's just call today the 15th now, and then we'll get ahead.
So
simple solution, and they did that a few times as time went on, as they saw that they weren't quite lined up yet. And now, of course, today with all our modern instruments, we're very precise, right? But again, the question is how does that have anything to do with the weekly cycle? Because what happened is when they went from September 2 to September 15, they didn't change the weekly cycle. So if it was Thursday, September 2, the next day would have been still Friday.
Right.
But they called it September 15.
Right. So they just changed the calendar numbers.
They just changed the numerical value assigned to the day. They didn't change the day. Mm-hmm. And so this is, I think, where people get confused, is they think, oh, well, they changed calendar. Because if you look on the calendar for this year even, 2023, September 2 is a Saturday. And if you skip ahead to September 15, it's actually Thursday. So that would be their thinking, that, well, if they did that, they would go from Saturday, the next day would be Thursday. So they actually, backed up and skipped a whole day and backed up 2 days. Mm. It's like, well, but that's not what happened. They didn't call the next day Thursday. They continued to call the next day the next day.
Right. Yeah. So what you're saying is the cycle didn't change at all.
So the weekly cycle did not change.
Yeah.
And of course, what is it? NASA? Yeah. They've done this tracking of the movements of the Earth and all this stuff like that, and they've gone way back into history, and they say that the weekly cycle of 7 days, the 7-day weekly cycle, has never ever been altered. It's never been changed throughout history. Mm-hmm. There's no, it was the Naval Academy that did that.
Okay,
that's what it was. Naval Academy did that. But they've seen in history, there was no historical record anywhere where the next day skipped ahead like that, where they went from Friday to Wednesday and eliminated some actual days out. That has never, ever happened. So then we got to go back to the Bible, because the question still remains, okay, well, what is our confidence then that when Julius Caesar made the calendar, that he assigned the correct days to the correct days? Because everybody was still running on a weekly cycle back then. Mm-hmm. But the names given that Julius Caesar gave were like Roman and Greek god names, right?
Right.
Prior to that, we don't really know what they called the days.
Well, as far as I understand, as far as the Jews go, they actually numbered their week like the seventh day of the week was the day. Mm-hmm. So they numbered their calendar approaching the seventh day. So the first day of the week was like 6 days before Sabbath.
Yeah.
The Monday was 5 days before Sabbath, and they just kept doing it that way. Yeah. So the pinnacle of the week was always on Sabbath, Saturday.
Right. It was all based on Sabbath.
Yeah.
And that's interesting, because I looked at the Greek that Luke wrote, because Luke wrote that in Greek. And when he says it was the first day of the week, the word week there in Greek is sabbaton. Mm. And so it's like he was saying the first day after the Sabbath is what he was saying. He wasn't saying first day of the week. He was saying first day after the Sabbath. So again, he was just measuring the days of the week in relation to the Sabbath. So this is really the most powerful point, is that the Jews in Israel had been keeping the seventh day of whatever. They had been keeping the Sabbath as a seventh day. So every 7 days was a rest day. And the commandment says, Exodus 20, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath. So the Jews have been keeping this religiously. And up until that point, when Julius Caesar made the calendar. So then what happened is Julius Caesar assigned these Greek and Roman god names to the days of the week. He called the seventh day Saturday. But the seventh day already existed. So what people are trying to argue almost is that the Jews somehow changed and started worshiping Saturday. Because this is the argument they make. They say, oh, you're worshiping the pagan Saturday.
Oh.
And it's like, no, because in order for that to be true, the Jews would have had to stop celebrating their weekly Sabbath cycle and actually have altered it to go, oh, we're going to worship on Saturday now.
And that would have been really difficult to do, because the Jews were super religious about keeping Sabbath, right?
Yeah.
So it would have been really difficult to get the whole nation to switch a day. Like it would have been really difficult.
There would have been some mention of that.
Yeah.
There would have been some mention of that, especially since it's such a religious, sacred, holy day.
Yeah.
For the Jews to upend their entire religious belief system and the basis of their entire government is based on the Sabbath.
There would have had to have been something in there.
There would have been some mention of it. Josephus was a Jewish historian, same thing. No mention from him ever of the Jews having to all of a sudden follow this earthly man-made calendar, right? So here's the point that I think is really important. We can go back to Exodus 16. Now this is actually prior to Mount Sinai prior
Right.
to when God wrote the commandments on the tables of stone. And he talks here, and this is, of course, about the manna that God gave to the Israelites on the ground. And he gave them instructions to collect that manna, and that would fall every day, and just collect what you need for the day. You come out in the morning, and it's on the ground. You come out and you collect it, and it gets you through the day. And he said if anybody collects more and starts hoarding it, it's going to spoil.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Overnight.
Yeah. He didn't want people hoarding it and being selfish and whatever. But then he said on the 6th day, he says, collect a double portion.
Mm-hmm.
Because, why? Because it's the preparation day,
Mm-hmm.
and the next day is the Sabbath. And so he says this here. This is in Exodus 16. And verse 23, he says, then the Lord said to them, this is what the Lord said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest and a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you will bake today and boil what you will boil and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. And so they laid up till morning, and Moses commanded, and it did not stink or rot, or no worms were in it. So all the other days, he said, if you take too much overnight, it'll rot overnight.
Mm-hmm.
But now on the preparation day, because the next day is the Sabbath, he said, no, I will preserve it.
Mm-hmm.
And so here we have verse 25. Then Moses said, eat that today, for today is the Sabbath to the Lord. So we have two things here, which should be very telling. We have God specifically from his own mouth saying, tomorrow is going to be the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you think God was confused because somebody changed the calendar?
No.
No, I mean, if God says tomorrow is going to be the Sabbath, and then Moses says to them the next day, today is the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
At this point in history, in Jewish history, there was no confusion about what the Sabbath is. This is really a thus saith the Lord, saying this is the seventh-day Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have this established by God with Israel. He's made it known to them, this day, today, right now, is the Sabbath. Don't work. Well, after that, of course, then now in Exodus 20, God codified that on the tables of stone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he said, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. So he's just really driving this home with them. So now after this, you know, anybody can study the Bible and read through. You get into, once they got into the promised land, were the Jews perfect? Was Israel perfect?
No.
You know, they have a history of breaking the commandments.
Oh, over and over and over.
And even breaking the Sabbath.
Oh, absolutely. Because they were doing business at one point on the Sabbath, and the Lord was furious with them for that.
Yeah, they were conducting businesses on the Sabbath. They were charging money to people on the Sabbath. And
sorry, folks, my phone just went off.
And they were, that's a good point, maybe it makes your minds off too. They were doing a lot of things on the Sabbath. Then, of course, the Pharisees carried on with this even further and started piling on a lot of other restrictions on the Sabbath as well. And I don't want to get off on a tangent here. The point is that there was numerous times after the Mount Sinai where God punished Israel for breaking the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
People were like killed because they broke the Sabbath.
Well, one man was stoned while they were still in the wilderness there. He went out to gather sticks on the Sabbath to have his fire, and the Lord commanded Moses that he should be stoned. It wasn't Moses brought that up. That was the Lord.
Yeah.
You know, so what that tells me, you know, nowadays we don't see that kind of reaction to breaking God's law, and I think partially that comes from the cross, and also there's the other aspect of the Jewish nation being a really new nation, and if God had given any lenience to breaking His law at that time, that they wouldn't even existed at Jesus' time had He not been so stern with them at the beginning, right? So I just like to bring that up because a lot of people get all bent out of shape on, you know, the people were stoned for breaking the law and stuff.
So the point is that God Himself reiterated numerous times. Every time He punished somebody for breaking the Sabbath, He was essentially reminding them that today's still the day, nothing changed.
Exactly.
You know, this is still the Sabbath, and you broke it. And that carried on right up until Julius Caesar made his calendar in 45 BC. And so there was no there was no debate, there was no dispute in the Jewish nation of Jerusalem, now being ruled by Rome. Rome was acknowledging that they had their holy day. So the only thing Julius Caesar did is he started calling it Saturday. Mm-hmm. But the day never changed. The day was still the day, the same day that the Jews had been keeping all that 1,400 years religiously for fear of being killed. You know?
Yeah, and they got so religious about it that they were even going after anybody that didn't follow their minute rules about it. Like
you couldn't walk more than a certain distance. You couldn't carry a heavy load. Yeah. Like they, you know, there was definitely no confusion about what day the Sabbath was. With the amount of burden that they were putting on keeping it. If there was confusion, you think people would have been arguing. They're saying, well, you can't convict me and stone me for breaking the Sabbath because you don't even know that this is a Sabbath.
Yeah, no, there was no confusion.
That never happened. No record of that happening.
No.
And so we have this, history with Israel of keeping that day so religiously all the way through. And then the only time where that was ever changed, and of course, the prophecy of Daniel came up, Daniel 7:24, I think it is. The prophecy came up where it said the Antichrist power in the future would seek to change times and laws. Yeah, well, that's true. But we have to look about what actually fulfilled that. You know, changing the calendar around, following the paths of the moon, which is only 29 and a half days a month, as opposed to following the path around the sun. Have nothing to do with the weekly cycle. Like those are a totally different measurement unit, right? You know, it has nothing to do with the week. You could have a 30-day week, you know, in the year if people so chose, and you can have a 10-day week, like they tried to do that. They could have a 10-day week if they want. They could break it up into sections of 10 if they want, and they tried that and it didn't work very good. And basically, all they did is they put the weekend off a few more days. Yeah,
and it's interesting because as far as I understand, the human body really works well on a 7-day cycle, right?
Yeah, and even in nature, there's a lot of things, and you know, we don't have time to get into all, but yeah, look it up. There's a lot of things in nature that operate on 7-day cycles, almost like it is a God-ordained system. So whether you call the seventh day Saturday or Orange Day or Purple Day or Porridge Day or whatever name you want to put to it, it's still the seventh day of the weekly cycle since creation. So I grew up as an Adventist, and it's funny because I just always called it Sabbath. I always call it Sabbath, and so I'd call it Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Sabbath.
That's me too, yeah.
You know, if someone asked me what the days of the week were, that's what I would say.
Me too, yeah.
And it wasn't until I, you know, graduated and got out involved in the world more that I started hearing more people calling it Saturday, and it just sounded so weird.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
And so really that's exactly what the Jews would have been going through when Julius Caesar came out with this new calendar. It would have been a very similar thing. But they held to their guns. They stuck with their day before or first day after the Sabbath. And so, like you said, we see that in Luke. Luke didn't call it Sunday because he was still, you know, even though he wasn't Jewish, as a Christ follower, he was still referring the days back to the Sabbath.
Yeah, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but one of the things that while we were talking that came to mind was the Sabbath actually kind of shows God's unselfishness. Because he chose the last day of the week to be his day. He didn't choose the first day.
Right.
He didn't demand that we choose the first day of the week for him.
Yeah.
He says, I just want the last one. You have 6 days.
Yeah.
Just give me that last day.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and it really does create a cycle of rejuvenation and rest, both spiritually and physically. And so this certainly is something that God has designed and ordained. And
well, if you look back in Genesis, it says that he specifically said he sanctified it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and let's just make that point too. Thanks for reminding me. The creation account is really where the weekly cycle comes from. It's not relative to the cycles of the moon, and we know that because the cycles of the moon, you know, if you don't really watch them, they seem random, right? Like you get a half a moon, and then all of a sudden you get a full moon, and then all of a sudden you get like a few days of no moon whatsoever, and then it comes back around again. It doesn't match up with the weekly cycle at all.
Right.
It's not like every Wednesday you have a full moon.
Right. Yeah.
Or every other Wednesday you have a full moon. There's no connection there whatsoever. But you got to sit and observe the moon for a month, and you'll see that.
I'd like to look
random.
I'd like to look at Exodus 20 just real quick if we could. Got to get there, Exodus 20. The one thing that I wanted to point out was, so I'm going to read 8 through 11, the commandment there.
Okay.
It says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gate." This is the part that sticks out in my mind. "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven, the heavens and the earth, and the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So, out of all the commandments here, we know that everybody agrees with 9 out of 10 commandments, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the one commandment that we're having trouble with is the one that has God's seal in it. It says, "I did this. I created the earth. I did all these things. I have dominion over this." Mm-hmm. So basically, he's claiming his ownership, and it's interesting how we as humans have forgotten the one day where he says, "Hey, I'm the creator."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing. That's the thing is he gives the creation account as the reason for the Sabbath, and some Jews might even argue and say that that the rescue from Egypt, coming out of Egypt, is the reason for the Sabbath.
I've had people try to argue that one with me actually a few times, because it does say that, and I think it's in Leviticus where it says, "Because I brought you out of Egypt, to keep the Sabbath," right?
Well, this is where he instituted the Passover, is when they came out.
Right.
When they came out of Egypt, then he instituted the Passover. The blood was put on the doorpost and all that. And then he said there'd be a 7-day period, and then the seventh day is going to be a holy convocation, a Sabbath unto you, and all that. So he actually did that with a lot of the feasts, and most of the feasts were called a Sabbath. And so they're very similar, but it's different from the Sabbath. Again, those were annual festivals that God instituted. And so
they were like a high Sabbath, a special Sabbath.
Well, sometimes because they don't line up with the 7-day weekly cycle, as we're saying, sometimes the Passover would actually land on the Sabbath day. And actually, this is the case when Christ was crucified. Is the Passover did actually land on that?
I think
week,
it landed that weekend,
week of the Sabbath. Yeah. And so I believe the preparation day was actually the Passover day.
It was, yes.
And so basically, what's interesting about that is that Christ, the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world, was actually crucified on the Passover day, where they were supposed to be crucified or slaughtering the symbolic lamb.
Yeah. And then what does he go and do? He goes and rests over the Sabbath.
And then he rested on the Sabbath day.
Yeah.
Like it was
even in death. Yeah. The Creator rested on the Sabbath.
Yeah, it was a very deliberate thing. And also because the priest would have been in the temple going to slaughter the lamb. And when Christ died, there was a big earthquake. And lots of stuff happened. And then it tells us in the Gospels that the temple veil between the holy and most holy place was torn in two, which desecrated the most holy place. Well, and this again is the prophecy of Daniel. And that the holy place would be desecrated, and it would put an end to the sacrifice. Well, that did. The priest couldn't finish the sacrifice because we had an earthquake, and the temple veil was torn. Well, that's because the true Lamb of God has now actually been sacrificed. You don't need to sacrifice the symbolic lamb anymore. And so all that fulfillment happened on that Passover high Sabbath.
So then that would bring us to the argument, well, the law was done away with at the cross, right? Well, no, not necessarily, because there was the written ordinances, right? So that's what was done away with. So all these high Sabbaths, these ritualistic things that the Jews were doing up until that point, that was done away with. But the actual Sabbath written in the stone was not done away with.
Right. And that's why we have to distinguish between which Sabbath or Sabbaths we're talking about. The fact that Jesus' very real death was the fulfillment of all those things. Paul writes that those were a shadow of things to come. Galatians says all those ordinances were added until the seed should come. And of course, he was referring back to Genesis, where we were promised that there would be a seed come to crush the serpent's head. So Paul says, until the seed comes, though they were added. But now that the seed has come, that's what was nailed to the cross. That's what was done away with, because you don't need to sacrifice lambs anymore because now the real lamb has been sacrificed and paid the price. And it happened on the Sabbath so that he could rest from the Sabbath. This is powerful when you start to really put those things together and you start to realize. And so this idea that there could be some confusion about what day is really the Holy Sabbath is just, it's really baseless. It's ludicrous, really.
No, I know.
Because when anybody who studies the scriptures and understands the Jewish culture and their religion and their everything that they went through to preserve the Sabbath, it's just silly to think that we don't know what it is.
So then that would really, like, after we've discussed this, we can clearly see that, well, I mean, I would like to ask anyone out there, honestly, to show me from the Bible that the Sabbath was changed to Sunday. If you can prove it from this book, I don't mean any other book, this book, I would love to see it. I'd even give you money. But I honestly don't think you're going to be able to. Now, there are some arguments in the New Testament where the apostles got together on the first day of the week and they were, organizing the alms to take back to Jerusalem and all that stuff. Well, that's clearly fine because they didn't want to work on Sabbath, right? So what did they do? They got together on the first day of the week to do this work.
To do the business of the church,
right? So that's why they were meeting on the first day of the week. They were actually worshiping on the seventh day of the week, right?
Yeah. And they broke bread. The Bible says they broke bread together daily.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just something that wasn't necessarily tied to the worship.
Yeah.
So probably one of the biggest points is there was a change made to the Sabbath eventually, and this is what Daniel was prophesying when he said the Antichrist power changed times and laws. And this did happen.
Yes, that did happen.
It wasn't until about 300 years after Christ, though.
Yeah.
And this was when Constantine created a holy day of his own making. And if you look up the history of that, you'll actually see that it specifically says they wanted to worship on Sunday, the day of the sun and the rebirth of the sun, which would be Sunday. They wanted to worship that day as Christians so that they would not be associated with the Jews.
They didn't want to associate with the Jews, and they were also trying to reach the Gentiles. So they thought that if they kept the Sabbath holy and, kind of rested on Sunday as well, that they would be, they wouldn't be abrasive to the Gentiles, to the pagan people, right? They didn't want to, they wanted to bring them into the church, right?
Yeah.
So they were just trying to, and that's another point, if the truth is the truth, don't mess with it, man. Don't try to water it down to save people because it just runs into problems.
Yeah. And so this is the point too, is they didn't want to be like the Jews who were still keeping
the Sabbath.
And now we're talking 1700 years after Sinai and coming out of Egypt of this regular 7-day weekly cycle. So much so to the point that the Roman power said, we don't want to be associated with that. We're going to create our own day. And this is maybe what a lot of people don't understand is the Catholic Church admits that Saturday is the biblical Sabbath.
Yeah, you
they
can
have
go
no argument with that.
Oh yeah. They're proud of the fact that they're the ones that brought it in as Sunday.
Right. So again, we have this history. We have the early church. We have Jewish history. We have Catholic history. We have all this history that testifies that Sunday is the first day of the week and Saturday is parallel to the biblical Sabbath. So, I just want to encourage people, don't fall for these things. It's really just a demonic thing to shake people's confidence, to distract people, and like I said, it's not an intelligent argument when you get into things with these people. It's clearly just a way to try to divide and sow confusion.
Oh, absolutely.
And the devil wants to do that more than ever as we draw near to Christ's return.
Well, if he can keep people from worshiping God on the true Sabbath, then they're actually breaking the Ten Commandments. And if you break in one, you've broken in all of them, right? So Satan is trying to keep God's people from keeping the commandments. So whatever he can find to do that. Now, I don't want to suggest that there aren't people that are going to not be saved, that go to heaven because they were worshiping on Sunday. But if this is speaking to your heart and you know that this is true, you're breaking the commandment if you're keeping Sunday and you know better.
Yeah, you're knowingly breaking the commandment. Yeah. So like this person I was debating with, he admitted that because of the confusion, there's no way to know. So he just worships God and keeps every day as a time for God. So he's admitting himself that he's no longer keeping, He's not even putting an effort into keeping the commandment anymore. So, we just pray for these people that because they have fallen victim to confusion and misdirection. But a lot of times they're the progenitors of it too. Mm-hmm. And so we just have to pray that God opens their minds up. And as Josh said, if this is speaking to anybody watching this too, it's not a big deal because we have a merciful, loving God who is ready to forgive anybody. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to find out that, oh wow, I've been profaning God's Sabbath my whole life. It's okay to do that. He
is already forgiven.
Yeah.
He's already forgiven you.
You just have to accept it.
Yeah.
And be willing to surrender your life and your schedule to God. And that's the hard thing because, like you said, society operates on Sunday being a weekend and Saturday's still a day of business. And so it's tough. It's tough.
Well, I mean, even to go further than that, I feel like Satan has targeted the Sabbath to cause humanity to profane it, in that everybody goes out Friday night and they're partying and drinking all night, and then they're just hung over and done with on Sabbath. Like they waste the whole day away laying in bed because they were partying the night before.
Yeah.
I feel like the Sabbath is a very special target because, again, it goes back to creation. It talks about God being the creator in the commandment in that, in Exodus 20. To get people to forget that day is a major attack on God.
Yeah, and that's, of course, the devil's plan. And that's very telling in itself, that if it wasn't a big deal, then why does the devil work so hard against it?
Yeah. And why is it so hard for us as humans to want to follow it too? That should say something too, right? Because we're all sinful. We have carnal nature. We have a natural bend towards evil, right? To sin. Yeah. So if it's difficult for us to want to keep that day holy, you got to wonder why. Yeah. Well, maybe it's because it's actually the true day.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I find that with many things in life. Doing the right thing is often harder than doing the wrong thing.
Yeah. However, I've begun to learn in my own life that the more that I stand for what I believe to be truth, the more peaceful I am inside. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have peace around me. It could be chaotic around me. But if I know that I'm following the truth in my heart is at peace.
Yeah. Yeah. Having that confidence. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, great. Again, thanks, Josh, for helping out in this conversation. Oh, yeah. It's always good. And I just hope that this episode is a blessing to people as well. And just stay tuned and keep watching and enjoy your Sabbath.
Absolutely. May you all be blessed.
Join Nelson Adventist Media on YouTube, Rumble, and Facebook for good sermons, praise time, prep talk, testimonies, health segments, and more.
Well, folks, thanks again for watching and participating with us in our ministry here at the Nelson Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's important if you could just like us and follow us on Facebook, or, like our videos and subscribe to our channel there on YouTube. That would help us a lot. And your financial involvement, too, is very much appreciated. The money that you folks have given has helped us upgrade our church, our lighting, our carpet. We've done many things at the church and our ministry here. We're looking forward to developing our health ministry. It's something that we believe is important for our community. And we need, of course, equipment and renovations for that as well. But we're turning our basement into a health ministry place for the Nelson community. And just appreciate and covet your partnership with us in that endeavor. And so thank you again for watching, and God bless you, and we wait for his soon return.